Hey folks, hope you're having a great day today. Today we're going to finish up chapter 10 in lecture. We really focused on the hot and heavy stuff last time, looking at all of the microanatomy of a skeletal muscle and then how all of that fits together to create those 15 different steps of the contraction, including that neuromuscular junction, 5 steps, excitation, contraction, coupling in 5 steps, and then the cross bridge cycling in 5 steps. And so, again, a lot of that information is going to be the basis of this test. That's what I really wanted to see that you know, is you understand that microanatomy and how all of it fits together to produce the contraction. Today's information is a little bit more kind of hodgepodgey. It's a little bit more of the leftover information. So we're going to have kind of different blocks of distinct information and kind of different types of information about muscles from here on out. So we're through the hard stuff that's really kind of all connected. And now we're about to hit just kind of some other topics associated with muscles. Our first topic is going to be energy usage, right? Supplying energy for skeletal muscle contractions. There's 3 ways to generate ATP, and really I want you to know that there's 4 usages, 4 types of energy that a muscle can use. So let's talk about this first. The first is referred to as the phosphagen system, but what the phosphagen system includes, and I definitely want you to know this, the first thing that a muscle can use is ATP, right? That's what it's trying to use, is ATP, and we see that term right there, ATP. Remember, that's our chemical energy. It's biochemical energy. And so the P in phosphate goes with phosphagen, right? But there's also another molecule called creatine phosphate. And this is actually misspelled. I don't know why they continue to misspell this, but you need to drop out one of these INs right here. I'm so sorry that they keep messing this up. Creatine phosphate, not creatinine. Creatinine is the byproduct. Okay, we'll talk about that when we get to the kidneys and how it's the second most abundant waste product in your urine. But creatine phosphate can recharge ATP. And those two combined, the ATP plus the creatine phosphate, create the phosphagen system. ATP is for immediate energy, and creatine phosphate recharges ATP for another 10 to 15 seconds, not very long at all. Okay, an additional 10 to 15 seconds is we're going to break this down and add some more phosphates to that ATP so that we can get more energy. Or actually, as we break it down, we add the phosphates back. So, first off, phosphagen system is what always starts our muscle contraction. We use the ATP and then we use creatine phosphate. Then, if we're going short term supply and we're doing more power types of activities where we're doing more bursts of energy release, right? And we're doing more powerful contractions, for example, sprinting or lifting weights, then that's going to put us into anaerobic very quickly. So, anaerobic is without oxygen. But generally, what happens, as long as you are drinking, eating, getting your oxygen breathing, then you're going to start to enter aerobic cellular respiration very quickly. So, anaerobic, I want us to focus on is more for powerful contractions. It's going to be where we use the oxygen so fast that we need more than we can get, right? So, usually we kick into aerobic metabolism, and aerobic cellular respiration is the process that's going to provide ATP. You definitely need to know that basically all that this is aerobic cell respiration or aerobic metabolism is using glucose plus oxygen to make ATP on demand. So we're going to start making the energy, the ATP, actually on demand as the muscle needs it. And again, then our limiting factor becomes oxygen. If we push ourselves too long in aerobic or we push ourselves too hard, too fast, then we need more oxygen than our muscles can actually get. So that puts us into this anaerobic state. So usually I like to list the energy usages in order. I like to go ATP, creatine phosphate, aerobic, and then anaerobic, right? And again, we can skip right over aerobic and go straight to anaerobic if we're doing more energy inducive and more oxygen kind of absorbing activities if we push ourselves too hard. Now, I've already told you what I want you to know about creatine phosphate, not creatinine phosphate. That's something not doesn't even exist. Creatine phosphate, again, is a high energy molecule and it recharges ATP for an additional 10 to 15 seconds. And after that point, we need to start making energy on demand. And so, in the beginning, before we can get enough oxygen in, we may undergo a little bit of anaerobic respiration. But the whole goal is to hit aerobic respiration as quick as possible. Okay, aerobic respiration requires oxygen. It uses the mitochondria, and it uses glucose to convert it into ATP. Okay, anaerobic, on the other hand, does not create ATP like aerobic does. Anaerobic creates something called pyruvate or pyruvic acid, and what this tends to create is lactic acid. So that's what I want you to know. Anaerobic respiration or anaerobic metabolism is going to create lactate, but that's better called lactic acid. And lactic acid, when it builds up in your muscles, it starts to cause those muscles to get sore and to get tired and to start shutting down. So lactic acid buildup is really what makes your muscles tired and what makes them stop functioning properly. You start to eat away at the muscle with an acid. You start to break it down, and as you break it down, then it starts to give up, right? Now, after you exercise, you're going to come back and you're going to rebuild that muscle that you just broke down, and you're going to build it to bigger, better muscle overall. So, this lactic acid is definitely an indication that you need to stop because you're starting to damage the muscle a little bit too much. Okay. Now, I don't want you to worry about all those details. I want us to keep this short and sweet. And again, ATP source depends on the intensity and the duration of the activity. So, I do like this kind of image right here. If we are simply trying to run 50 meters, then we're mainly going to stay in that phosphagen system. We're going to be finished in 5 to 6 seconds. So we're going to have to really prime that phosphagen system instead. If we're going to sprint for less than a minute, for example, then we're going to go straight from phosphagen into anaerobic, right? But if we're going to long-term run 5-6 minutes longer, marathon, we're going to start phosphagen. There may be this anaerobic stage where we adjust, but in general, we're going to hit aerobic as quick as possible. Okay, it's not just 400 meters is the limit, right? We're not in anaerobic right here. A lot of times we're already in aerobic. And so it just depends on how hard you're pushing yourself in the beginning. As long as you start slow, you're going to hit phosphagen and almost practically go straight into the aerobic respiration process. Now, as I mentioned, that what we're doing here is using glucose plus oxygen to make ATP to keep all of these muscles going. And so we may start to run out of oxygen. We can keep eating sugars and keep getting glucose in, but we may hit what's referred to as oxygen debt. And oxygen debt is after exercise. We have worked so hard during the exercise, we've robbed our body of a lot of the stored oxygen on hemoglobin and our myoglobin. And also, we have depleted a lot of our glycogen, our stored glucose reserves. So immediately following exercise, many times you continue to breathe really hard. And what you're in is oxygen debt. You're trying to continue breathing hard to get more oxygen in, to restore pre-exercise conditions, right? To try to get the body back to normal, try to get rid of that lactic acid. We don't want to convert it to glucose, right? We want to clear it through the kidneys and get it out. So this is something that we can do, but that's going to be extremely dangerous. It's going to make some byproducts that are not good for us. And so usually we're trying to clear that lactic acid out of the body and actually get it out through the urine, or possibly we can convert it into another source and get it out at the lungs. And we'll talk about that in 211. So oxygen debt, time after exercise, needed to restore pre-exercise conditions. We're breathing heavy, we're adding O2 and more sugars. Now, let's talk about how we can categorize muscle fibers. We've got different ways that we can categorize muscle fibers. Here we can talk about the contraction that they make, the type of contraction. Does it produce movement? Does it not produce movement? And then we can also talk about what's giving it, how it's getting its energy. Now, I really want to focus on more of the contraction generated and the different types of fibers that make these contractions. So first off, I want to talk about some of the characteristics. We're going to see power and speed and duration. That's kind of the key here. And this power, as it says here, it's related to the size of the muscle fiber. So if you want more powerful contractions, you're going to have larger muscle fibers to produce those more powerful contractions. So let's talk about this. Fast twitch versus slow twitch are the main two types that I like to discuss. Fast twitch fibers, these guys are going to contract quickly. So they contract more quickly following stimulation. But the problem is that they're going to produce a very strong contraction. But also the problem is that they are going to have a shorter duration. They're going to fatigue quickly. So fast twitch, fast to contract, but fast to fatigue. And the goal here with these fibers is to create a strong contraction. So fast twitch fibers tend to be larger because they are larger fibers producing a more powerful contraction. These are for more power, right? So these are for more power, for lifting more weights, not for running a marathon, right? For running a marathon, we need endurance fibers. Endurance fibers are slow twitch fibers. Slow twitch fibers are slow to contract, but they're slow to fatigue, right? So that means that they can act longer without getting tired. They don't produce as powerful of a contraction, but these guys are more for endurance. And really, we tend to need a combination of these. When we look at our muscles, we tend to have a combination of both of these, fast and slow. And we also have a flavor in between called intermediate fibers. And the intermediate fibers are kind of a little bit of both, right? They're kind of the mid ground. Now, our textbook tells us one thing, but other textbooks have told us in the past that our body is mainly intermediate fibers in amongst some fast and some slow, right? So most of our fibers aren't really made for super endurance, but they're also not made for super power, right? So they're kind of in between, and those will be our immediate fibers. Slow fibers, again, these are skinnier. They are slower to contract and less powerful. Okay, they want to remain an aerobic. So let's mention that. Slow fibers have more blood vessels, and they have myoglobin. Remember, myoglobin stores extra oxygen. And this looks like hemoglobin, so this makes the muscle look more red. So I definitely want you to know slow fibers, if we're talking about chicken, we're talking about dark meat, right? That's red meat. That's a very darker meat compared to the white meat that we don't see the blood vessels in. So slow fibers are for endurance. So we're going to see slow fibers on places that chickens need their endurance, like their thighs and their legs. They run around all day. They don't fly very much, right? They fly to get away from things. So their flight muscles are more fast twitch or fast fibers. Intermediate fibers are in between, produce a fast, powerful contraction, mainly aerobic, but they contain some myoglobin. And so as a result, they don't produce as powerful as a fast twitch, but they produce longer contractions or more sustainable contractions because they can store extra oxygen. So it's kind of in between both, a little bit of power, a little bit of endurance. The fast fibers, these guys are the largest. Here it says they're the most prevalent, right? And that's not necessarily correct because, again, most of ours are kind of in between. We can kind of train and we can change some of our fast to slow or slow to fast. These guys provide power. And if we're talking about raw speed, then they provide speed. If we're talking about long-term endurance speed, then they don't provide that. Fast fibers are mainly anaerobic, right? These guys don't have myoglobin. They don't have as many blood vessels. So this is our white meat and chicken. These are lighter. And so the breast, right, that's what controls the wings. And the wings also are white meat in a chicken. They may be sold as dark meat at Popeyes or KFC or something, but they're actually white meat, So whenever you're eating chicken wings, that's truly white meat, kind of like the breast. Now, these, again, meant for more powerful contractions, but again, they're going to fatigue very quickly. Now, as I mentioned, there's a mixture of these, and it all depends on what muscles we're using. But here's an example. We can see these darker, and then we've got some lighter, but most of these tend to be these in between, not really dark, not really light, just kind of a shade in between. And those are our intermediate fibers. And so we can kind of see how they are in different percentages almost of power versus endurance there based on the different color. The darker that those are in the middle, the more endurance they are. The lighter they are, the more power. Let's talk about tension real quick. Tension is a active pulling force, and tension is what creates movement. So whenever we produce tension, we pull on something, and that pulling action is going to create our overall movement. Now, I really despise that they're talking about some sort of experiment with a frog's leg muscle, right? That's what they're using here. I don't care about a frog's leg muscle. What I care about is our muscles. So we're going to discuss this as it relates to our muscles and not specifically the frog, because again, who cares about a frog? If you're a frog, I'm sorry, but this, we're talking about human A&P, not frog A&P, right? So not discriminating, just this is about humans here. Whenever we look, this is our kind of our graph of the tension that's produced over time whenever we make our simplest type of skeletal muscle contraction. Here they're even showing you, they got this poor frog leg muscle hanging up right here. They got some weight on it and they're measuring the tension that it's producing, okay? Because they're zapping it even though it's outside of the body. Now, this basic skeletal muscle contraction, I want you to understand, is called a muscle twitch, right? Real quick, take your arm and just twitch it, right? Just one quick twitch, right? One little flinch and then relax. Super quick, less than a second, right? We're talking milliseconds. So a twitch, if our arm is twitching, our eye is twitching, our face is twitching, it's really not good for anything, right? So we're going to have to use this twitch and change the twitch to create a more powerful contraction to get big macro movement, overall movement. Now I'm going to do this a little bit different. The stages of a twitch, as we go back, they like to just give us 3 stages. I'm going to do a little bit different, okay? Make sure that you know those basic 3 stages, but I'm going to give you a little expanded area. At the beginning, step 1 is really kind of rest, right? So at this point, this muscle's resting. And then step 2 is the stimulus. So we stimulate that muscle. This is the action potential reaching the sarcolemma, that motor end plate. Now the problem is it takes a while for the AP to go down the T-tubules and release the calcium, and the calcium then binds at troponin tropomyosin and uncovers those myosin binding sites. And then finally, we're going to get myosin grabbing and pulling. In all that time where it takes to kind of lead down to the myosin grabbing and pulling, that is called the latent period. We've already stimulated, but we're not pulling yet. We're doing other stages of our contraction before we get to the power stroke. So the latent period is our 3rd stage, and it's really their 1st stage. And the latent period is just a pause after stimulation and before tension is produced. Once we start to make tension, this is referred to as the contraction phase or the contraction period. So here we can see tension is rising as time goes by, and so we call that the contraction phase. Okay, so here's where we're going to produce the movement. And then we're going to relax. We're going to go back to rest. That is our relaxation period. That would kind of be our 5th overall stage. And this is going to bring us back to our resting point. And then we kind of hit stage 6, which is at the beginning over here again, which is rest, right? So we start at rest, we stimulate, takes a little time for the stimulation to cause the pulling. Then we get the pulling, so the latent period leads to the contraction phase. And then we relax before we hit rest again. Now again, do a twitch with your arm and just kind of see it's a real quick movement, kind of just jerk real fast. That's a twitch. The twitch is not good for anything, okay, by itself. So we're going to have to figure out how can we make this twitch stronger. There's 2 ways that we can make a twitch stronger. The first way is recruitment. Recruitment means to add more motor units to a contraction, okay? So more motor units involved during a contraction, more force is generated. Okay, so recruitment is one way, recruiting more motor units. That's a way to think about it. So that's our first way. The second way is what we're going to focus on, though. The second way is by summing waves. Wave summation is a process where we can build twitches and kind of stack them on top of each other to get more powerful contractions. And so this wave summation is a process, and the key here, what I want you to understand about wave summation, is that if we stimulate a twitch before it's finished with its relaxation phase, it will produce a more powerful contraction. It will make more tension. So we can kind of see a graph here. If we allow this twitch to completely relax, then we can't stimulate it and sum the waves and get more tension. But if we stimulate this before it relaxes, here it's starting to relax, but it doesn't finish its relaxation. We stimulate it again, and now we get a more powerful contraction. Okay, so wave summation. Before a twitch can finish relaxation, stimulation causes a more powerful contraction, more tension. Now, the goal here is, and this graph is kind of screwy compared to most graphs that we've seen. The goal here is to get up towards the top, to get up towards our maximum tension area so that we can actually make movement. And so wave summation leads eventually, if we continue to zap it, continue to stimulate it, we're eventually going to hit a plateau. This right here is never drawn like this in any other textbook. Incomplete tetany is usually up here on this same plateau. It's just going up and down. Okay, it's just kind of going up and down versus complete tetany, right? So incomplete tetany, I want you to understand, is creating maximum tension by stimulating more often, but there are still rapid cycles of contraction and relaxation. Okay, now if you start twitching and jerking your arm back and forth, right, kind of up and down, but at the same time you're bending at your elbow, right? It's kind of this jerky motion and you're bending at the elbow. You're having contractions and relaxations because the jerkiness is coming from the relaxations after the contractions. But we're building to more of a maximum tension. We're moving at the elbow. We're still twitching, but we're using these twitches now and we're getting major movement. And so now we're entering what's called incomplete tetany. Tetany itself, also called complete tetany, is where we stimulate so frequently that we remove all relaxation phases. All the relaxation phases have been eliminated. What that means, now we are contracting and we're producing maximum tension. Now, contract at your elbow, bend at your elbow, and hold that muscle tight. Keep contracting as hard as you can. Even though your elbow is bent, you can feel your bicep bulging and starting to hurt even sometimes, because you're still contracting, even though you finished that contraction, the movement. This is tetany, right? And this is what we talked about before, the process of tetanus, that bacterial toxin getting into your bloodstream can cause muscles to experience complete tetany, or as they call it, tetany, right? And so this is a contraction without relaxation, right? We've eliminated the relaxation phase. Eventually we could hit fatigue, but in some muscles, for example, lockjaw during a tetanus problem, then they don't hit fatigue for months, right? It's very painful. A sustained contraction in the body, we are creating a form of tetany. We're creating this sustained contraction without a relaxation. But what's really happening when we're doing this is it's not all the muscle fibers are working at the same time. I want you to understand that a sustained contraction, right? Here it says no tetany occurs. Tetany does kind of occur during a sustained contraction, just not with the entire muscle. That's the key. So this is a little misleading. So a sustained contraction, what I want you to know, and I've mentioned this before, that motor units rotate being on and off during the contraction. Stimulation of different motor units in the same muscle. So we may have three groups. We may use group A for the first 10 seconds and let groups B and C relax. And then after 10 seconds, we let group A relax and we let group B kick in. And then that does its 10 seconds. And then we do the same thing and we let those two relax. And then we go to group C. And so now it just depends on which ones are active. So a sustained contraction, we're really just rotating different groups of motor units that are active. Okay, let's get to muscle tone. Muscle tone, you know what muscle tone is. You see somebody and you can see the shape of their muscles even though they're not contracting, but their muscles look like they're contracting, right? And that's exactly what they're doing. Those muscles are contracting even at rest. And we say that that is referred to as resting muscle tone, but I want you to know that this is due to resting tension, okay? I want you to know that resting tension creates our muscle tone. Tension at rest, some muscles, even when they're resting, are still active. And so the more that we train that muscle, the more that we work that muscle out, the more resting tension it gets in the muscle, and the more it contracts at rest. Now think about this. If you have good muscle tone, your muscles are contracting even though you are resting. So you are burning more energy simply by having better muscle tone. So the more you work your muscles, the more energy they burn in the long run. And so that's the key. Building muscle tone is a great way to lose weight, right? Not just dieting. All these low carb keto diets are just so silly. You need to eat a balanced diet. You need to eat less calories than you burn, and you need to build muscle. It's just a fact. That's how you lose weight, right? You can't just keep eating burgers and no bread and lose weight. That's about silly, all right? Now, let's talk about the different types of contractions as far as isometric and isotonic. Okay, so here, iso means same. So isometric means same length. So I definitely want you to know that isometric contractions, we are making maximum tension. We are stimulating that muscle, but there is too much resistance to overcome. When we have more resistance than tension, we don't get movement. So isometric, the muscle stays the same length. If you stand against your wall and you push on the wall, you should not be able to push that wall down, right? The wall has more resistance than the tension your muscles can make, and as a result, that's called an isometric contraction. I always like to do this one. Put your palms together right in front of your sternum, right in front of your chest, and now squeeze those palms together, push them together really hard, right? That's a great isometric contraction. Both arms are pushing, and you can start to feel that in your chest and your pec muscles, right? So there's a good example of an isometric contraction, trying to push a car that's in park. Isometric. Okay. Isotonic contraction, right? This is where we're going to make that tension, but it is greater than resistance. So that kind of tells us tension has to be greater than resistance to get movement. So here in an isotonic contraction, tension is greater than resistance, so we get overall movement. We're going to make the same tone, but now we're going to change in length. Okay. So most contractions we think about are isotonic. Some contractions are isometric, though. Concentric versus eccentric. I don't really want to go into this. Muscles can only produce tension when they shorten. That's a fact. Muscles can't produce tension when they lengthen. They can, but how they do this, and this is so weird, an eccentric contraction, right? This is not making tension when a muscle lengthens. This is lowering tension so the muscle lengthens. That's the way we need to think about it. The muscle is contracting, but we're putting less tension on it so that now the resistance is overcoming it. We're still contracting, but the muscle is getting longer, right? So if you hold up your textbook and you hold it up for a second and then you slowly let it down, that eccentric contraction happens when you slowly let it down. You're slowly letting down the tension on your muscles, and it's dropping that book and it's lengthening that muscle, but you're not making tension by lengthening that muscle. We can't push with a muscle, we can only pull. So this sometimes is confusing. Concentric just means makes tension when it contracts. Eccentric, it's still making tension as it lengthens. Okay, so be careful with that. Don't let that trip you up. I've had several people go into personal training that have heard about this and they have questions about it, and they're extremely confused because, of course, a lot of this information and these things that you read on the internet are not necessarily scientifically based, right? And so, definitely be careful how you read these and make sure you understand exactly what it's saying. As I mentioned before, muscle fatigue may take place whenever we've depleted sugars or oxygen. And so the whole key is when we don't have ATP being produced, then the muscle can't contract. So muscle fatigue is muscle can't contract despite being stimulated, right? So we're still trying to stimulate it, but it just can't contract. You have worn that muscle out. Okay. Now, when we exercise, we make larger muscles, and this is called hypertrophy. And so we talked about this under tissues, if you remember back in the day. Hypertrophy is where we increase skeletal muscle size, and that's due to repeated stimulation, to working it out, right? It's going to get bigger. We're going to have more mitochondria. There's going to be more glycogen reserves, and that's going to give us a better ability to make more ATP. We've got a bigger muscle. We need more ATP to do it. We're going to add myofibrils. We don't add more muscle fibers. When you work out, your muscles get big. You don't add new muscle fibers. You make the ones that you have larger by adding more myofibrils to the inside. If you don't use it, you lose it. And so atrophy is the opposite, decreasing in muscle size due to lack of exercise. It takes a lot longer to build it than it does to lose it, and that's the problem, right? So we can lose muscle mass, a third of your muscle mass in 3 weeks. So that's a lot of muscle to lose very quickly. And so lack of exercise is definitely not a good thing. Atrophy always means lack of stimulation, and so that's going to mean loss of size and loss of power. Now, as we get older, we know that everything craps out, right? The muscles are going to get smaller. They're going to become less powerful. We're going to start to see issues with oxygen storage. So our endurance is going to go down. Our strength is going down as well. We don't have as much blood, so we can't exercise as long, and we're not going to repair those muscles quite as fast. And this all starts in your 30s, right? So kind of crazy, but we all start crapping out around our 30s, and we start to see some of these similar things. Reduced capacity to recover from an injury. As I mentioned, you have some sort of injury from working out or a bruise, and it takes a longer time to heal. Let's mention these anabolic steroids real fast, and then we're finished with our skeletal muscle, and we've just got about 5 minutes with both cardiac and smooth. Anabolic is always a term that means to build. So if we use an anabolic steroid, it's trying to build new muscle. Okay, that's its goal. And so anabolic steroids have been used as performance enhancing drugs. We call them PEDs, performance enhancing drugs in sports. Anabolic steroids are rampant in baseball. Okay, baseball, all they care about is hitting the ball over the fence, right? And that gives you more money. And so if you can knock the dingers, well, then there you go. You get billions of dollars practically, right, over your career. And so people are cheating a lot with anabolic steroids, and these are obviously not a good thing. It mimics testosterone, and it causes increase in muscle mass. The problem is that it also increases our risk for heart disease and stroke and kidney and liver problems. It also starts to make the testicles smaller, right? The males, testosterone is supposed to be produced by the testes. If the testes realize that you are injecting testosterone into your body instead, well, they take a vacation and they just get smaller. They disappear. They atrophy, right? So then the testicles atrophy, and as a result, the lack of testosterone made here starts to develop breasts in men, right? So we start to see breast development in men. We also start to see acne, especially if somebody's taking testosterone illegally. We start to see backne, right? We start to see it on the back and the upper shoulders on the back. It starts to cause high blood pressure, and you start to see aggressive behavior. You see people angry all the time, and so these people that are bodybuilders, they do tend to be aggressive. They tend to see facial hair and menstrual irregularities in women. So women that use this for competitions, to try to look big, then they're going to have issues as well. So definitely not a good thing, anabolic steroids. Now, as I mentioned, let's talk about cardiac muscle, and then we'll talk about smooth muscle real quick, and we'll be finished with this chapter. First off, cardiac muscle, don't forget that these are short branching cells. They kind of look like letter Y's. Sometimes they look like Y's on both ends, so they branch on both ends, right? These tend to only have one nucleus. Here they say two. I still haven't seen this very much anywhere else, so we're sticking with one. These guys do have some striations, but obviously, sorry about that, not as obvious as the skeletal muscle, which is obviously striated. Okay, they're going to have sarcomere, so they're going to do a similar contraction to what we've learned. They have a lot of mitochondria, and the goal here is to maintain aerobic metabolism, aerobic respiration, making ATP with glucose and oxygen. And that's what the mitochondria does. Cardiac muscle cells don't like anaerobic, right? If you make them anaerobic too long, then you have a heart attack and you die. So this is not a good thing. Don't forget the key term is always intercalated disc, right? These are those connections between our cardiac muscle cells. Here we can kind of see is an intercalated disc connecting those two muscle cells together. And here's what it looks like from the side, right? There's another one. Here's another one. Okay. So we're going to see all these different types of connections. So these intercalated discs, they connect the cells together so that they function as a group. Okay, it functions as a group. I'm not going to get into desmosomes and gap junctions right now, but that's the key thing right here, gap junctions. If one is stimulated, they're all going to be stimulated at the same time. And that's because these gap junctions form tunnels in between the cells. Kind of connects the cells and makes sure that whatever happens inside of one cell also happens to all cells that are connected to it. These guys are also autorhythmic. In other words, they make their own stimulation. Okay, they are self-stimulating. Cardiac cell muscles, they create their own heartbeat. The brain does not stimulate the heart to do the heartbeat. Now, here's that image one more time. Here's a couple of differences that we saw between cardiac and skeletal. Again, branch, shorter, intercalated disc, and autorhythmic. Let's talk about smooth real quick. Okay, like I said, short and sweet, not very much, for tests, but intercalated disc is almost always on a test when we talk about cardiac muscle. When we look at smooth, don't forget that we find these inside of organs, especially inside of the walls of tubes of our body, right? Inside the walls of our tubes. So any system that has a tube, respiratory, digestive, urinary, repro, even other places like the iris of your eye, the erector pili muscles in the skin. So I want you to focus on the tubes, right? And the whole key is that it controls the flow through the tube. Okay. Other muscles are going to do other very specific things, control light into the eye, control hair lifting and not lifting on the skin, things like that. When we look at these guys are said to be fusiform. I like the term spindle shaped as well. Sorry about that again. So fusiform or spindle shape, what it means is it's fat in the middle and it's tapered at the ends. It kind of looks like a cigar just a little bit, right? So here we go, kind of tapered at the ends, fat in the middle, and there's our fusiform or our spindle shaped. Spindles are what we used to, when we were textiles, textile nation, that's what we used to put thread on, right? These guys only have one nucleus. These guys are kind of small, right, and short, not really as long as skeletal muscle fibers. I don't really want you to know this, but they don't really have sarcomeres. Okay, so that's something. Their anatomy is very different from the other things. Sarcolemma, transverse tubules are absent. You don't have to write that down, but I want you to know for a fact that they don't have sarcomeres. Okay, that's a characteristic that I want you to be aware of. No sarcomeres in here. We just kind of see a random arrangement of thick and thin, right? So kind of weird cross hatching there. Now, this is our last slide, and this is just talking about some of the characteristics of smooth muscle. The first thing is it's fatigue resistant. These guys have a low energy requirement, and so as a result they can function a lot longer without getting tired. So these guys are fatigue resistant. These guys have the ability of plasticity. Plasticity means that you can stretch them and they will still function properly, right? So you can stretch them out of shape and they're still going to work. If you swallow a giant mass of food and the esophagus stretches, then that doesn't mean the smooth muscles aren't going to work. If it's a skeletal muscle and you stretch it too far before it contracts, then you're going to have problems with it contracting. You're not going to produce as much tension. But here, if we stretch it, it can still produce the same tension and the same contraction even when it's stretched. So that's what the word plasticity means, to change shape and still function. Okay. These are involuntary as well. And so that kind of wraps up our last info on smooth muscle. Okay, so involuntary, dealing with, we can't control it. These guys just open and close these vessels without us realizing it and control that flow. That wraps up our chapter 10. Again, this is a test all by itself. This information I covered in this presentation is much easier than what we covered in the previous presentation. Again, it's kind of these little distinct pods of information, kind of separated from each other, but still related to muscles. So you're going to definitely get a question on the test about each one of those different groups, and the importance of each of those, different types of areas: fast twitch, slow twitch, isometric, isotonic, the phases of a twitch, and then wave summation, incomplete tetanus, complete tetany, that kind of thing. So we're going to have a couple questions on each of those, but again, the main focus is going to be on that material we covered in that previous presentation. So definitely go back, review that one as much as you can, and answer your study questions, and you should be good to go for this lecture test. All right, if you have any questions, please contact me. Otherwise, I hope you have a wonderful day.